Somewhere buried beneath the pink slips, the rust, and the rubble lie the dreams of the city that literally put America in the driver's seat. There still breathes the stale air of an industrial colossus, a symbol of America's global prominence. It was a city with unlimited potential. Of course, these days, Detroit has become little more than a gloomy mascot for the recession. Desolate areas across the nation find comfort as they nod to themselves and reassuringly say, "At least we're not Detroit." The sad reality is that the rest of the nation is not that far behind the Motor City. And sick of it as they may be, the proud people of Southeast Michigan can say little to combat these reports. After all, few cities have felt the ruinous toll of recession more extensively and more destructively than Detroit. Once the fourth largest city in the country, it's now an eye-straining effort to look through the abandoned factories and crime-addled slums to see that glorious past. Back when GM and Ford still ruled the highway to prosperity, Detroit was a cultural summit. The 1950s and 60s were a golden age for the American economy, and the Motor City was a happy exposition of why. As recently as 1969, the national unemployment rate was only about 3.5%. Americans were busy working and prospering. The United States was sustaining itself and exporting its valuable products to the rest of the world. And cities such as Detroit provided the engine for what made this economic boom possible: manufacturing. Detroit's big three automobile companies, GM, Ford, and Chrysler, provided vehicles for the rest of the world. More importantly, perhaps, they provided the vast majority of vehicles for the people of their own country. This business model made sure that even if the flow of money into the United States halted, there would still be no consistent flow out of it. Where there was money, there were jobs. And where there were jobs, there was more money. Detroit was confident and thriving on this principle. But comfort and overconfidence are often the downfall of a society. During the 1970s, the rest of the world was squaring up to take down the American machine. By undervaluing their own currency, countries like Japan could gain an insidious advantage in the trade market. They pushed for widespread free trade, with their sights set specifically on putting their American competition out of business. As foreign markets began to grow over the next 2 decades, the prospect of unrestricted global trade became increasingly discussed. By the time the U.S. joined the World Trade Organization in 1995, it was already flooded with automobiles from Eastern Asia and Europe. Detroit's economic heartbeat, the auto industry, was in for the fight of its life, and the odds were not stacked in its favor. Without labor regulations, environmental laws, or a minimum wage, many foreign nations are able to work and produce at costs that aren't realistic for American companies. Companies outsourced to take advantage of cheap labor. Factories were shut down. Jobs were lost. Meanwhile, major foreign competition for the auto industry was pouring into the States, and it was showing no signs of slowing down. Under the new conditions, the parent companies were inevitably forced to shop overseas for everything from their steel to their stereos just to stay competitive. This eventually suffocated smaller businesses in the Detroit area that were supported by supplying the big three with their homemade goods. Detroit was reeling on the brink of a collapse. During the crash of 2008, the city hit rock bottom. Its blue-collar backbone shattered by poor policy, Detroit watched as the very companies that once fueled its success begged for government bailouts. Unemployment rose to over 20%. The streets and the buildings darkened, and the national media began the onslaught of sob stories. Detroit had been reduced to a decaying urban monument to the economic collapse. The people of Detroit are intrepid, however. They remember that the middle class is the key to economic strength and sovereignty. After all, their city was the embodiment of this model. But what can be learned from the mistakes that plunged Detroit, and a great deal of the entire country, into this state of welfare? Outsourcing and unrestricted global trade are still exterminating American manufacturing. That essential middle class that empowered the nation is disappearing into poverty. The city of Detroit is a not-so-shining example of the 180-degree transformation that can occur when industry is taken away. If the United States insists on opening up more free trade markets, this type of austerity can and will threaten the entire nation. Detroit's fall from grace is proof that an economic superpower can easily fall from wealthy to wasted, from shimmering to shut down, from luxury to landfill.